Good morning and welcome to day 49 of F260 at First Baptist Meridian. Today we look at Numbers chapter 13 and 14. Very important chapters right in the heart of this book. As we mentioned yesterday, Numbers is a book that's all about transitions. And one of those important transitions is the generational transition. And you see that in the form of a census at the beginning of the book and then another census at the end of the book. The first census is a census of those who have come out of Egypt. The second census is those who will go into the promised land. And by and large, with very little overlap, those are two distinct groups. Why? Because of Numbers 13 and 14. In Numbers 13 and 14, God has brought his people to the cusp of the promised land, and he's ready to bring them into it. The question is whether they will have the faith to follow his lead, whether they will trust the God who brought them out of Egypt to bring them into the land he promised to their forefathers. So they appoint a representative from each of the 12 tribes. And these 12 scouts go into the lands and check it out for 40 days. Important. There's that number 40 again. And at the end of 40 days, they come back and make a report to Moses and the people. Importantly, of the 12 spies that go into the land, all 12 agree that the land is everything God said that it would be. However, of those 12 spies, only 2, Joshua and Caleb, believe that God is everything he said he is. Everything he said he would be for his people. The rest of the 12, the other 10, don't trust the Lord enough to deliver the land into the hands of his people. They believe that they will be slaughtered, that their wives and children will become plunder. Plunder, by the way, the last time we saw that language was when we were talking about what God gave his people coming out of Egypt. And so on the basis of these 10 spies, this negative report, the people as a whole lose heart and don't trust the Lord and won't go into the land. This, of course, arouses God's anger, but Moses, as he typically does, intercedes on behalf of the people and says, God, don't wipe your people out here, or people will say that you weren't able to bring them into the land. God, I know that you have to punish the guilty, that you're a just and righteous God, but God, please don't be done with your people. And God says, well, here's what we're going to do. For those who trusted me to keep my word, for those who believed in my promises, Joshua and Caleb, they will see it, but the rest of them will not. They were worried that their children will become plunder if they go in now. Instead, their children will become the inheritors of the gift that I wanted to give them. The rest of this nation will perish in the wilderness. And that's why a trip that should have been a couple of months becomes several decades. That's why the census of those coming out of Egypt is different from the census of those who will go into the promised land. And here's what's so interesting to me when you get to the book of Joshua, which is when the conquest actually happens. Just like in Numbers 13, in Joshua, before they go into the land, they send scouts. Only in Joshua, how many do they send? Not 12, this time only 2, the number that gave a favorable report the first time around. Israel will spend 40 years in the wilderness, 1 year for each day that the land had been scouted and the people didn't trust the Lord. Also importantly, when you get to the New Testament, how does Jesus' ministry begin? Immediately after his baptism, his passing through the waters, which kind of mirrors Israel coming through the Sea of Reeds, Jesus goes out into the wilderness. And how long is he out there? For 40 days. Whereas Israel in the wilderness constantly grumbled to God about their food and their water, what does Jesus voluntarily go without? He fasts. He goes without food and water. And when he's tempted and tested by the devil, what's the first temptation? Turn these stones into bread. And Jesus captures the truth that Israel again and again in the Old Testament misses. Man will not live on bread alone, but on every word that proceeds forth from the mouth of God. In Numbers, despite all the signs, all the wonders, all the things that God had done for Israel, they do not trust the promises that come out of his mouth enough to pursue him. They grumble so much about the immediate provisions that they miss out on the ultimate provisions. And Jesus, as our Messiah, shows us a better way. That because God has, in Jesus Christ, met our greatest and most eternal need already, we do not have to live as the type of people who question God from day to day, minute to minute, moment to moment. Because Jesus has shown us that the inheritance is sure. Jesus is the greatest provision of God's love and grace and power and promises. Like Paul says in 2 Corinthians 1, all of God's promises are yes, amen, in Jesus Christ. So be the type of person that walks by faith today. God is always able to do exactly as he says. When we doubt him, it says something about the way we see the situation, not so much the way that he does. So keep reading, keep reflecting, and keep responding as we continue in Numbers tomorrow. God bless you, and I'll see you then.